This is an event I often think about, as it could have gone way worse than it actually did. It happened in the summer of 2015. I was 16 at the time. My parents had recently been hired at better paying jobs, so they were able to finally upgrade from our 2-bedroom apartment to a house of our own. The house wasn't new by any means. It was built in the 90s and it had its fair share of cracks, including a pretty big dent in the wall by the front door, but it was nothing my dad couldn't fix. It also had a bright red front door, which my parents didn't really like, but they planned to eventually replace it. Other than that, the house was pretty nice, just a regular 3-bedroom, 2-bath cookie cutter with a fenced yard. We were so excited to move in. Finally, the day came. I remember my parents signing all the paperwork, getting a couple keys, the garage openers along with the code, and a few housewarming gifts from my grandma. We were busy for the next week or so, unpacking and decorating our new home. It was a Friday night, and my parents wanted to celebrate by throwing a small barbecue party at the house with our closest friends and family. However, they had to cancel last minute due to some bad storms in the area. It was the dead of summer in the Midwest after all. I was actually a bit relieved, since I had been running a cold for a couple days and wasn't feeling the best. My parents, however, were in a much more festive mood and decided to grab dinner at a fancy place instead. Like most guys my age, I was happy to stay home and play my video games. My parents left around 7 p.m., and I wasted no time booting up my PlayStation and getting right to it. Everything was fine for a while, but after some time, I heard the garage opening. I looked at the clock and it was just after 7:30 p.m. I thought that was odd since there's no way a fancy dinner only takes 30 minutes. I figured maybe they changed plans again or forgot something. A few seconds later, I heard the door that leads from the garage to our living room open and then slam shut quite hard. Harder than my parents had ever closed it before. A little thrown off now, I yelled from my room, asking if they had forgotten something. But I didn't hear a reply. I paused my game and went out to the living room. When I turned the corner, I came face to face with a man I had never seen before. He looked so disoriented, but also mad at the same time. He was standing maybe 8 feet away from me, with his arms hanging at his sides and struggling to keep his head up. I was petrified, with my eyes wide open, trying to figure out why or how this stranger got into my house. The man then looked straight at me, and he seemed to get even more enraged. He pointed at me, and slurring his words, he yelled, "Why are you in my house?" Stunned, and thinking that he stole my line, all I managed to say was, this is my house." He lowered his hand and looked around. After a few seconds, he mumbled something to himself, walked over to the couch, and literally passed out. I stood there for a few seconds before realizing that I should call my parents. My dad picked up and I told him how some creep had come into the house and collapsed on the couch, saying this was his house. He told me he would be there as fast as he could, and to do what I should have done in the first place, call the police. I waited in the kitchen holding a knife in case this freak decided to wake up and do who knows what. A few minutes later, I heard the police outside, and they came and woke the guy up, handcuffed him, and took him away. My parents came home a few minutes later and just held me. I think I was still pretty shocked because I don't remember much after that. My dad filled me in later. Apparently, that officer had seen the guy before. Fearing for her and her children's safety, his wife had called the cops on him several times when he had come home drunk, yelling, and sometimes getting so mad that he would throw things or punch the wall. Eventually, she had enough and divorced him. Shortly before the divorce, though, his wife took the kids and moved in with her parents, leaving this man all alone in a home with 3 bedrooms to himself, a fenced-in yard with no kids to play in it, and that ugly red front door, which he would end up selling to none other than my parents. You see, my parents had been so excited to finally own a house, and after signing all that paperwork and getting the keys, They got right into moving and completely forgot to change the garage code. This man got drunk at a bar, then drove his pickup truck to our house, completely forgetting he had sold it. Since he no longer had the garage opener, he got out of his truck and punched in the code. He was so disoriented because he recognized the house, but not the furniture or me. In what must have been a moment of clarity, he probably remembered he no longer owned the house, but was too drunk and just laid on the couch. It's a sad situation for him, really, but I'm glad they took him away. Right after this, my parents changed the code, as well as the door locks just in case. Thankfully, we never saw him again. When I was about 16, my dad, brother, and I lived in an old, run-down house in the middle of nowhere. It was a private rental, since my brother would do work for the landlord in exchange for our rent. Our landlord never came off as particularly creepy, but that could be because I rarely went outside when he came over to talk to my dad, and he wouldn't dare do anything in front of him. I was home alone one day. My dad and brothers went out. I don't remember where. I had my dog in a fenced yard outside, but that was it. I was in my room, doing whatever I was doing, probably playing The Sims 2. We lived in the middle of nowhere and there was a long driveway which the window of my bedroom directly faced. I could see or hear anyone driving up the driveway. I saw a car pull up. It wasn't my dad's, and I immediately freaked out. I ran and shut all the blinds in the house, turned off all the lights, and made sure the doors were locked. It was our landlord. He lived next door, about 2 miles from our house, and yes, that was the closest house. This wasn't the first time he'd come here unexpectedly. It happened twice before, and both times I was home alone. Those first 2 times he was only there for 10 minutes, walking around the outside of the house and then quickly leaving. But this time was different. I grabbed the big kitchen knife and hid under the kitchen table. I heard him pull up outside and open our front gate. My dog outside was going crazy and barking, and I heard him yell, "Shut up, mutt." I could hear his footsteps walking up to the door, and then he tried to open it. I was freaking out. At this point, I texted my dad. He was coming straight home, but it would take him like an hour. The landlord continued to walk around the outside of our house, trying to peek into each window. The house is old and has 3 doors you can come in through. He tried to open all 3. I thought maybe he didn't know I was home and maybe the last 2 times were a coincidence. But he started saying things, including calling out my name. He knew I was home alone. I couldn't hear what else he was saying through the double brick walls, but I quietly creeped through the house, following his voice up and down the hallway. That's when he said something I'll never forget. "I'm going to burn the house down, but I'll let you out first." Of course, I didn't take him seriously, which scares me even more. He wanted me to take this threat seriously. That's the part that gets me. I know exactly what would have happened if I had believed them, and my life would have been completely different. He was there for at least 30 minutes, maybe closer to an hour. He was persistent. He left before my dad came home. I told him everything and we were actually evicted soon after. I still don't know how he knew I was home alone. My dad never saw him heading in my direction when he left, and he could tell my dad was gone because his car wasn't in the driveway. But how could he have known I stayed behind? We lived in a caravan at my uncle's house for a year before finding a house in a different town. This happened a couple months ago, but it's still quite fresh in my mind, and it's by far the creepiest thing that has happened to me. I live in an apartment complex by myself. My specific building has 3 floors, and I live on the first one. Over the last several months, ever since I started living here, I've gotten to know a few of my neighbors, including this very sweet old man that lives in the apartment above me. For the sake of this story, we'll call him Larry. Larry is around 70 years old and quite fit for his age. He typically goes on a morning jog every day, and I often see him at the complimentary gym in our apartment complex. Having that said, I don't run into him all that often, as I've been working the night shift at the hospital for quite a while. I'm a nurse, and I'm hardly ever home except to sleep and eat. One night, I wasn't feeling very well, so I was allowed to leave work early, sometime around 3 a.m. As soon as I got home, I took some medicine to help with my headache and went straight to bed. I was so tired, I don't even remember falling asleep. I woke up about 20 minutes later to what sounded like someone thumping on the wall. I wasn't sure if I had been dreaming, so I stood still a few seconds waiting to see if the sound came again, and it did. The thumping wasn't very loud, but it was loud enough to wake me up. It sounded a bit distant, so I knew it wasn't coming from my bedroom window. As I lay there contemplating on what to do, the thumping came yet again, except louder and more frequent. This time I quickly jumped up and walked to the living room, turning on the hallway light as I walked. My apartment has a small porch area in the back that you can access through a sliding glass door. For the apartments above me, this serves as a patio. The sliding door has big blinds that I always close because I don't like people being able to look straight into my apartment, especially at night. As I came into the living room, the thumping became louder. I walked over to the sliding door and opened the blinds. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw, not even being a nurse. I stumbled backwards and nearly tripped over my coffee table at the sight of a man with his face pressed against the sliding door. He was bleeding from his forehead and blood was smeared all over his face, as well as my door. Being a nurse, I immediately wanted to help this guy. But being a girl living alone, I hesitated, thinking this might be a prank to get me to open the door. I had barely turned around to go get my phone when the bloody man pounded on the door and yelled my name. That's when I realized this bloody man was Larry. I immediately opened the door and started tending to his face. He was in pretty bad shape, and I could tell his head had started swelling up. I called 911 and did what I could while the ambulance got there. When they finally arrived, I told the officer what had happened. He took my statement and he said he would be in touch if he needed anything else. They took Larry to the same hospital I work at, but I had to wait a couple days to visit him. He told me he remembers being on his patio late at night, but doesn't remember why. He said he thought he fell asleep and then woke up on the grass behind my apartment. Somehow he fell from his patio, breaking his left wrist and hitting his head on the way down. Larry was probably unconscious for several minutes before he came to and started banging on my door for help. He was most likely in shock and didn't have his keys with him, so he couldn't get back into his apartment. It's honestly a miracle he survived that fall. In pure coincidence, I was feeling sick that night and had been home in time to help him. I have no idea how he managed to fall from his patio or why he was up so late at night, but I'm glad I was there to help. He's back in his apartment now, and he had some family come visit him. As for me, that was by far the creepiest experience I've had outside of the hospital, and I hope I see him out on his morning jogs again when he fully recovers.